We're here today with Mr. Edward Flaxbart. He was in the U.S. Army, 1st Division, 16th Regiment, where he was a private during World War II. He began his enlistment in August of 1943 through September of 1945, served in World War II, and fought over in the European theater, where he received the Purple Heart. So I'll just start the interview by asking you, where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor, and you can go ahead and tell us your story from there.
Okay, when Pearl Harbor occurred, I was in high school, sophomore as I recall, and I can well remember the day when it occurred, when the news came over the radio, that was, of course, the beginning of the war, and it was 2 years after that, when I graduated, that I eventually went into the service.
Okay, well, if you want, I know you've got an outline here written of your experiences. If you want to go ahead and go through some of that, and then we can kind of follow up.
Okay, that's fine. Let me explain this outline a little bit. Back in December of 2005 and early January 2006, the Tulsa World published an article, or several articles, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, which is the last operation that I saw over in Europe. And this prompted me to put down on paper for my children and their spouses and my grandchildren some of these experiences that I had during World War II, thinking that it might be of some interest to them and possibly for posterity. Then, of course, this particular project came along, and it seemed to me that it gave me an opportunity to add an audio and visual aspect to this information that I had written. And that's what I really planned to do during this interview, was to go over these notes that I had made for my kids and add those components to it.
Okay, good. Well, if you want to go ahead and get started, that'd be great.
Here's what I said. David and Susan and Jenny and John as well, my kids and their spouses. Over the years, as you kids were growing up, I seldom talked to you or to your mom, for that matter, about my experiences in World War II. I'm not real sure why this was. There was no particular reason for it. But in December of 2005 and January 2006, as I already mentioned, there were articles concerning the 60th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. And this brought back memories to me, and also to the fact that perhaps some of this should be noted for future generations to ponder, I guess. I suspect that as one gets older, there's a subconscious need to unburden one's minds of things never expressed, but nevertheless items that are kind of tucked away in the crannies of your brain somewhere. So, as I said in that information that I wrote down, here's the story of, quote, what Daddy did in the war, at least mostly about the time spent in the continent of Europe. I graduated from high school in St. Louis in June 1943, and as most everybody at that time, immediately went into the service. Most of us volunteered because the draft was going to get you anyhow. And I volunteered for the Army Specialized Training Program and was inducted into the service at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, right below South St. Louis, in, I believe, August of 1943. The Army sent me to Kansas University to School of Engineering, and the object of the program was to develop engineers, graduate engineers, that would eventually wind up in the Corps of Engineers. Also part of the program was the simple fact that after a semester or so, you did take time out from your university studies to take a basic infantry training. And this I did at Fort Benning, Georgia, after one semester at KU. while at Fort Benning, the complete program was canceled because they figured they didn't need that many engineers and they needed more of other people. So I was sent to Camp Livingston, Louisiana for advanced infantry training. And rather than stay with the 78th Infantry, when they needed replacements in Europe, and a large number of us were pulled out of that group and sent over to the European Theater of Operations.
Was that the ASTP program?
ASTP program
Okay.
is what I was in. I first went to England to a replacement depot, and then over to the continent in a replacement depot right behind the front lines in northern Belgium. And from that, this was in the Hurtgen Forest. From that point, I was assigned to the 16th Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, as it's known. And this first division had made Africa, Sicily, D-Day landings, and if you can believe it, many of the people in my group had made all of those landings and were still fighting. I had trained as a BAR man, which is a Browning automatic rifle, and as a sniper. But fortunately, they didn't need either of them. They needed 60 millimeter mortar people, which at least were a few yards behind the front line. So I considered that a positive move anyhow. It was a particularly harsh winter in Europe. Snow was calf deep and hip deep in the drifts, and I can still remember at night digging a pit to sleep in and covering it with pine boughs rather than just sleeping on the dirt. But when you woke up, your body heat had thawed out the ground, so you were sleeping in a bed of ice water. Wasn't exactly conducive to good rest. The first battle I was involved in was the 1st Division taking the German city of Aachen, and that was the first German city captured by any of the Allies. It wasn't
was
really
this prior to the Battle of the Bulge, or was this?
This is prior to the Battle of the Bulge.
Okay.
Yeah, from the Hurtgen Forest. This would have been in November 1944. It wasn't too much of a battle because it was the first German city to be taken by the Allies. The civilians had pretty much abandoned the city. And the German soldiers were mostly untrained kids, 16 years old and under, just looking at them, I would imagine. So a lot of prisoners were taken and we took possession of the city. The platoon I was in was housed in an estate mansion that had pretty much been demolished. I can still remember there was a grand staircase, and on the landing of the grand staircase was a grand piano that was utterly destroyed. We stayed in the basement for safety's sake, and I can remember there too that the basement was full of jams and jellies that were quite tasty. Little break in Army food, but the basement also contained crock after crock of fermenting cabbage that they were going to make into sauerkraut. The smell was so overwhelming. I can remember we carried all the crocks and set them outside rather than have to put up with it where we were trying to sleep. It was in Aachen then that I was first involved in the capture of any German soldiers. And some were wounded. I can remember one night that another GI and I helped one of the German wounded. He had a badly broken leg. He had an arm around each of our shoulders, and we carried him back to the aid center. And he kept insisting that in his German, Heine kaputt, German dead. We tried to assure him in English, which he didn't understand, that no, he was going to be okay, that he'd be taken care of. That was mid-December. 1944, I guess, when we took Aachen, or maybe early December. And then the 1st Division, for the first time since they had been in Europe, the whole division was pulled back for Christmas break. And our particular, I guess, battalion, I'm not sure how big of a group, was sent to Liège, Belgium. And several of us were quartered in a barn that adjoined a house, which is typical of European buildings. Family was very friendly, invited us in for meals and what have you. And we had free reign of the city. And so we were able to go around. Remember, that's where I had this one photo taken that the kids have of my helmet and 1st Division jacket. This stay was short-lived. On December 16th is when the Germans broke through the American line in the Ardennes forest and created what was eventually termed the Battle of the Bulge. Their objective was to rush through and capture the town of Antwerp, Belgium, which was a major Allied supply base. So we packed up and headed out from Liège, really not knowing what had happened or where we were going. As information really wasn't given to us. In the articles that I mentioned, they showed German positions and Allied positions, which weren't really accurate. There weren't any positions. It was nothing but utter confusion, and nobody knew exactly where anybody was. Our objective was to head south and pinch off the Bulge while Patton was coming up from the south heading north, and we would eventually meet somewhere.
And you were in Liège this time?
No, we left Liège and marched through Malmedy. If you look at a map, you'll see Malmedy in Belgium, and then we're heading on to Saint Vith. So that was the plan. But actually, the Germans were pretty much stopped by their own problems. Their supply lines were so extended that they could not get supplies up to the troops that had broken through, nor ammunition. So consequently, as we moved, there were a lot of abandoned German tanks and trucks along the way because they had no fuel, they had no ammunition. But that wasn't always the case. You sort of marched down a road, and if somebody took a shot at you, you tried to figure out where they were and clear it out. But there also was another aspect to that march, in that because we were had an objective and were moving as quickly as we could, we had no ability to take care of any of the German wounded. You just had to pass them by and let them alone, and that was pretty much a mind-numbing experience to have to do that. At one point, I can remember on this trek, we dug in near a town that I thought was called Herve, H-E-R-V-E, phonetically. I've never been able to find it on a map, so I'm not sure if that's correct. And we were not in the town, but near the town, and there was a building in town that had a stove, and we'd take turns going into town to kind of warm up, since it was pretty miserable out there. And I'll never forget that one day when one of my friends in the group went to town to warm up, and while he was in that building, a mortar shell came down the stovepipe, of all things, and he and everybody in the building were killed. I can still remember his name, Mike Messina. He was from Philadelphia, and he had seven kids. I remember that. I can remember two in that battle. One time I heard a shell or something coming in, and I hit the ground and banged my knee on a frozen clod. Fortunately, the shell landed right next to me, but was dud. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. The only good thing that happened was that it kept me off of night patrol that night because I couldn't walk very well. It was here in the Ardennes, while I was on night watch, that my feet froze in the snow. We had no snow boots or anything of the sort, just plain old GI shoes. And of course we were in more than ankle deep snow constantly. I was out there all during the night, kept shoes on till dawn, but by then the swelling had cut off the circulation in my feet.
So that was trench foot. Right?
Like trench foot, well, it's frostbite. Trench foot is from water only, not constant water. Frostbite is from cold. The results are the same, but that is a distinction. I was evacuated and wound up in Paris in a hospital. My right foot recovered for some reason or other. My left foot didn't. Gangrene set in that foot, and part of my foot was amputated in Paris. I was transferred to another hospital in Cardiff, Wales, where I had some skin graft work done. And eventually then went on to Glasgow, where I boarded the old Queen Elizabeth and came home on the Queen Elizabeth. I can remember in route home is when Roosevelt died and Truman took over as president. We came to New York. I went to the O'Halloran General Hospital there. And the thing I can remember about O'Halloran is the first time I ever saw television, because they had local New York City broadcasts, and everybody jammed into the day room to look at this new phenomena. I was transferred to Winter General Hospital in Topeka, Kansas. The Army generally tried to put you near home. Since St. Louis was my home, that was fairly close. And there they did some final bone trimming and closure surgery on my foot.
Is that what you got your Purple Heart for?
Yeah, which wasn't quite correct because I wasn't really wounded in service. But I got it anyhow for whatever reason. And then first VE Day, Victory Europe came, and then VJ Day, Victory Japan, and then I was discharged from the service from Topeka, Kansas, from the hospital. One little side note, and I know you kids know this, Evelyn, my wife, who I lost about 4 years ago, we traveled to Liège, Belgium in the 90s. We rented a car and drove through the Ardennes, where I had been, but there was no longer any evidence of the battles fought there. It's there that I could not, when we were driving, trying to look for this little town of Herve that I couldn't find. It's now just a quiet and peaceful countryside, and we did go on to Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne made their historic stand against the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. Bastogne is interesting. A Belgian citizen had opened a museum there featuring both the Allied and the German, or featuring both Allied and German Army displays. These displays included old trucks and uniforms and all sorts of memorabilia. And it's very tastefully displayed. And it was interesting because there were a lot of Germans and a lot of Americans wandering around, looking at all this. I'm sure they were veterans, as I was. But if any person who travels to that area should stop in Bastogne and see this museum. I presume it's still there, because it's a great reminder that we shouldn't ever allow this sort of thing to happen again.
Was that the Martisan?
What's that?
Was that the Martisan? memorial that you're talking about in
I
Bastogne?
don't.
With the big monument, you know, and the pillars and everything. Was that?
No, I don't. That's not Bastogne. This is where the 101st Airborne refused to surrender, and General McAuliffe gave the reply to the Germans and Dutch, which they didn't understand what he was talking about. And somebody had to translate it for them. I don't recall any other monument there in Bastogne. I could be wrong, but I don't remember that.
Okay.
Well, that's my story.
Okay. Well, I've got a lot of questions for you, if you don't
sure.
mind. You know, as a replacement, you know, a lot of things have been written about the system of how they replaced soldiers during the war, and how demoralizing it was to, you know, it could be demoralizing to be called a replacement. I mean, did you have any feelings about that, or were you just kind of, you know, happy-go-lucky and you were there to do your job?
Well, I don't think that was anything demoralizing, particularly. Of course, I don't think there's anybody that isn't or wasn't particularly scared of the whole situation. But you had to admire those who weren't replacements, who were still there and had gone through all of these various battles with the group. No, I would say that that's not true at all.
Okay, good. So whenever you were brought up to the front lines, how did they bring you into your new unit? Was it how were you treated? Were you treated very well when you first brought in to the unit?
Yeah. I would say very much so. A lot of those old timers with the group, you know, like Mike Messina that I referred to, and several others, we became very good friends. Let me tell you, during the war, there's not much time for any introduction or instruction. They said, "Hey, you're with the 60 millimeter mortar group." Well, I had trained on mortars, so I knew, you know, what to do, and that's it. Here you are. This is your group. Work with them and see it. That was it.
Since you participated in the Hurtgen Forest campaign, essentially, what were your thoughts? I mean, a lot of the accounts I've read about the Hurtgen were, you know, how thick the forest was and how difficult it was for a military unit to maneuver in there. Did you encounter any of that?
That's a very true statement. I've forgotten about that, but that's right. It's a very dense forest. At night, I don't ever recall being in an area that is that completely dark because of the density of the forest. The war had destroyed a lot of the trees from shells and bombs, but it still was an extremely difficult terrain to maneuver through. Really, the Ardennes was similar, but not as much as the so-called Hurtgen or Black Forest area. That's true.
How much time were you actually in the Hurtgen? You know,
probably no more than a month. I've forgotten them, but in that range, we well, in the forest, not that long, because I'm including when we took Aachen, which is in that area, but obviously is not forested.
what was the feeling among your unit when you took one of the first German towns?
I don't think at the moment that we knew that.
Really?
that was a fact. That was something we learned later.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I don't think we really knew that. A lot of that sort of information doesn't filter down. You're out there, you don't know where you are. I'm not even sure I knew it was Aachen at first until we, got into it, there's not time to give a lot of information to everybody. You just follow orders and do what's necessary to be done. That's about the way war is, I'm afraid.
And you said when you entered Aachen, most of the civilian population had left.
They had fled. They had gone.
Was was Aachen still, was it, how was the town for, was it, had it been shelled a lot? Was it?
Oh, yeah, it had a lot of destruction. As I said, this sort of mansion that we stayed at was basically decimated, because there was a lot of shelling, before, we went in to take the town, but taking the town was nothing. There was no defense essentially at all. We found German soldiers sleeping when we came in there, even. Wake them up and take them prisoner. They obviously that particular area was guarded by, or was defended by kids, really. And I presume that part of the reason for this is that they were already building up the forces that in a few weeks would create the Bulge. Mm-hmm. They had pulled troops from other places to mass in the Ardennes. And I think that was part of the reason that there really wasn't that much of a fight.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the captured German soldiers. Were they pretty eager to go to surrender to American forces?
Yes, I would say so.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't interested in trying to put up any kind of a fight. Mm-hmm. I don't really remember when we came in there that there was much of a fight. They were ready to surrender. Mm-hmm. I don't think they had much leadership. They had very little, if any, training. Mm-hmm. As I said, they were young kids mostly.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that the route that you guys took was through Malmedy and St. Vith. This would have been prior to the Malmedy massacre, is that correct?
Let me think. No, because the Malmedy was in Allied hands at that time. So I would have to presume that had happened earlier.
Mm-hmm. Because the Germans would have done it.
They were out of there. Mm-hmm. They were back against the German border, which is Aachen is right on the border of Belgium and Germany. Mm-hmm. So no, that would have been an earlier event.
So had you heard anything about that at that point?
No, all we did was just walk through it.
Actually, now I remember. I think they didn't discover that until later on, like a month or two later after the snow.
We knew nothing about any of that sort of thing.
Right.
Really.
Were you involved in any firefights?
No.
No?
Not really. Mm-mm.
Good for you.
Yeah. I don't think that wasn't a particularly wouldn't be a particularly successful way of fighting in the forest like that in that terrain. You use that a lot like when troops are holed up in caves or that sort of thing.
Oh, I don't mean, I'm sorry, not when I say firefight, I don't mean flamethrowers. I mean, like, were you involved in just actual, battles, short little battles, like a firefight with guns?
Well, to some extent, fortunately for me, not as much, because when we were in the Hurtgen, before we took Aachen, there was some skirmishing back and forth. But then when we finally moved forward, as I said, most of the resistance had pretty much faded away. And then in the Bulge, with all the confusion of where anybody was, periodically you'd run into some enemy fire, but it wasn't like line against line. I never got involved in anything like that, just because of the circumstances. Of the battles that I was involved in.
What was your impression of the weaponry you guys carried? I mean, you said you carried a Browning, right?
Well, in the mortar, of course, the M1 rifle was the main infantry.
The Garand?
The Garand, yeah. However, in 60 millimeter mortars, we carried not the big rifle. What was the? I've forgotten the name of it now. It's a smaller bolt-action rifle. It's not an assault, but more of more of a protection for your mortar group. A 60 millimeter mortar was perhaps 100 yards behind the line. I'm not sure of that number, but you were that far behind the line, lobbing the shells to enable the frontline infantry people with the M1s to move on.
I see.
But I can't.
Was it the 1903 Springfield rifle?
No, not the Springfield. What we used for sniper training.
Really?
Yeah, Springfield. But that was only training, fortunately.
Did you come across any German armor in?
In the Bulge, yeah. But mostly, again, in the Bulge, most of the armor that we came across was disabled or had basically just run out of fuel, just sitting there. So I was fortunate in that score.
The dud shell that you said landed next to you. How did that affect you? I mean, you said obviously your knee was hurt, obviously from the frozen dirt clod you hit, but my lord, that was
scared the hell out of me.
Wow, I mean, I bet you think back to that a lot and realize.
Yeah, I can think of that. I can remember that.
Wow, was that your closest call?
Yeah, I would say that's my closest call.
Wow. How did you feel about the injury you sustained from the frostbite, and
one of the feelings, I guess I'd have to admit, though I guess I shouldn't be ashamed to admit it, is that at least you're getting away from the front line.
No, that's true.
But that wasn't the major item. I don't know. At that age, let's see, what was I? I would have been 19 years old. Some of those deep thoughts don't exactly come to you. You just go with the flow. Whatever is.
So most of the time, whenever you would, like in the evenings, when you were on the front line, for instance, or moving through the towns, did you stay in houses at night to stay out of the elements?
No, most of the time you dug in.
Really?
You dug in the ground. It's only like in Aachen where you get into a city that buildings. Well, as I mentioned in Aachen, we stayed in the basement because if you're going to be shelled, you don't want to be up above ground. You want to be below ground. So if there wasn't something below ground, then you dug in so that you had some protection from shells and so on.
Did you ever encounter any of the German, like the tree bursts, where they would send the shells into the tops of the trees and explode?
No, I don't remember that. I don't remember anything like that.
Okay.
They're mostly just conventional mortar. Most of it on the front line is mortar, because you're in the U.S. Army. There's both 60 millimeter and I think it's 81. They're a little larger and they're a little further back. Most of the front line action, I would say, would be mortar shells. Your long distance artillery was used to soften up bigger areas rather than pinpoint. Although you use it for close in too, but you didn't want it to land on your own troops, I would presume. So usually you had like the mortars were the big items on the front lines.
I had a question. I can't remember what I was going to ask you now. What was your feelings about the German soldiers? Their equipment, and what was your impression of them at that point in the war?
The only direct contact that I had with the German soldiers was in Aachen, as I mentioned, and from an equipment standpoint, of course, most of these were riflemen. They had some, I don't know what sort of rifle or a sidearm, something of that sort. But I didn't really gain an impression one way or the other. Of course, we knew that the Germans, the Panzer divisions, had excellent tanks. And earlier on in the war, and maybe even at that point, Their equipment, I would have to say, was superior to some of the Allied equipment, which was outdated. The Germans were pretty much ahead of the game in a lot of weaponry. Another thing I remember about the Germans was the old buzz bombs. We would, in the front lines, you'd hear them and you could even see them. They were so slow, going overhead, heading for, somewhere back there, even England, going that far back.
Wow.
And once in a while, some of them would quit. You could hear them, and if they stopped, you knew they were coming down because they weren't meant for you, but they just failed. And then you'd hear them blowing up somewhere in the vicinity.
Wow.
That wasn't this an occasional happening. Most of them just kept buzzing on over. I think the next generation of those were called V2s or V1s or something. Those you couldn't see or hear, but the buzz bombs, you could see them.
Wow. How about Allied air power? Did you guys call in a lot of air support at times?
That of course, the Allies were very, very superior, and we had a lot of air support. Yeah.
So how did it work whenever you guys would need Allied air support? Can you describe for me a circumstance or an example for when you would use air support?
Yeah, I would say, keep in mind, you wouldn't use air support for the immediate ground forces. But again, using Aachen, which is my experience, they would soften up the area before you moved in. Aachen was bombed extensively and shelled extensively before we moved in to take it. And that was a primary purpose. Then, of course, also in the Bulge, once the weather cleared, if you recall, in the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans broke through because there, among other reasons, besides the superior number of troops, the weather was horrible, and Allied air power could not get over there to do anything. But once the weather cleared, then the Allied planes were constantly searching for the German
The real turning
lines.
point in the battle at that point,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
and for like tanks and anything else moving along roads, they were fair game for the Air Force. So that was a very important issue.
How often were you able to keep in touch with your family?
Oh, just the only way you kept in touch was sending what they called V-mails, little pieces of paper that you could write a letter and then turn it in somewhere. I'm not even company commander. It might take a couple months for it to get home. I can remember talking about mail. I can remember after I came home, I was injured in January. As I said, I went to Paris, Cardiff, and came home, O'Halloran, Topeka. And it was in May that I got to Topeka. And a Christmas package that my folks had sent kept following me. And finally I got it in Topeka in May or June.
Is that right?
Yeah. You just brought that to mind. I forgot about that.
What was your impression of the guys you served with, and can you tell me some stories about them? You said a lot of these guys served from 1943 and in Africa all the way
Yeah, this was those old. They were of course generally older. They had gotten into the service back when the draft was first instituted, and they were drafted because they were generally had families and so on. They looked after us kids, I'd say. My impression of them, they were great. They were great guys.
But how old were they really?
I'd say oldest maybe in the 30s.
Oh, really?
Yeah, late 20s or early 30s. As I recall the draft, they would draft you up to age 35, I think. so they would have been, and maybe some of them were not quite that old, but just looked that old.
Had a rough,
That could have been,
time of it too.
That could have been a problem or a point too.
Yeah. What was your impression of your officers? How did you feel? Were the quality of commanding?
I would say the quality of any commanding officer that I ran into was very high. That included Fort Benning and training and Camp Livingston. These were people mostly drafted like everybody else, but maybe got into OCS, officer training, candidate school, I guess. But all of them really that I encountered, I would say were good quality people, good training. Some that were harder to get along with than others, but not that bad.
Looking back at that point when you first got involved in the first real action you saw, was your training automatic? Did your training take over? Or, how did you view your training at that point? Did you feel like you'd been well trained?
Yes, I would say so. I would say so. I mean, I got thrown in after mostly training in something other than 60 millimeter mortars. I had some training in it, and I knew how to set them up. We started off as kind of grunt people, carrying ammunition, and then you'd have a gunner, an assistant gunner, and then ammunition carriers, and that's where you started off. And then eventually, of course, you learn to also get an opportunity to set it up and fire and so on. So we worked as a team. You worked as a team always.
How did you said you worked on the 60 millimeter mortars? How did that actually work? What was the process that you'd have to go through every time you'd move, for instance, from location to location, and then to set up and fire? And how do you get the coordinates?
You would have. I'm recalling now. One of the team would go up front, so where they could see the enemy, and then you would set it up to, and what you control was the angle of the mortar and also, of course, the direction, and looking at how many yards they would come back to you. Okay, the enemy is so many yards out. You'd set this thing the best you thought it would be, and fire a shell, and the scout would see where it landed and then tell you what kind of correction that you had to make to send it into an area where there perhaps was a concentration of troops or a machine gun nest or something, whatever your objective was.
Did you have to take into account wind when you did this? If the first time you fired, or did you just kind of adjust based upon where it lands?
It adjusted pretty much from where it landed. They would say, okay, you need so many yards to the left or whatever, and you went too far, so move it up a bit. So it's a trial and error.
So if you're off by, let's say, 20 yards, what adjustments would you have? How fine would the adjustments have to be to move to drop your
some of those details, after all of these years, I don't exactly remember, but there was. I can't remember how they were calibrated, but there was a procedure that so many turns or clicks meant so many yards. I mean, that's my recollection.
Okay.
I've really forgotten some of the details of it after all these years, but you just tried to zero in a little better.
Now, how big was a 60 millimeter mortar?
60 millimeter. Well, 60 millimeters
in diameter.
Okay. Yeah. So about that big, and the 81 millimeter was a bigger.
How much explosive was in that? What would you use a 60 millimeter mortar against?
Personnel.
Personnel.
Yeah. It's not what you would use to destroy a building. I mean, it do damage, but it's more of a personnel thing. Actually, I don't know if you're familiar, a mortar is nothing more than a tube with a firing pin, and when you set it up and you pull a pin off of the shell and you drop it in, and as it hits the bottom, it explodes and then goes out. and over. That's the way it works.
Was it kind of cumbersome carrying that stuff around?
Yeah, ammunition, yeah, they're fairly heavy. I'm not sure if you carry six shells or 8 shells in a pouch, and then if you use them, you went back, got some more. You know.
And those were usually stored some distance behind the
Some
front?
distance behind the line, yeah. And there might be people bringing them up to you in jeeps and so on, bringing ammunition up to the front line.
Wow. We've got about 15 minutes left. Is there anything you'd like to that you haven't covered here that you'd like to talk about or cover at all?
Well, you mentioned before when you brought up the people, and there's one incident that's kind of interesting. At least, well, it is mainly to me, but when I went into the service at Jefferson Barracks, there was another fellow, all kinds of us. We came in there together, and I was assigned to the serial number 17163268. You don't forget that. And this fellow, name is Ken Jones, was right behind me. And he was assigned 17163269. So we both went to Kansas U. And then we both went to Fort Benning for our basic training. And we were assigned to the same company, the same squad, even the same squad. And as I said, he and I were both BAR men in the same squad in Fort Benning. So we got to be pretty good friends. We were transferred to Camp Livingston. Both of us were transferred into the 78th Infantry Division. We wound up in the same company and the same squad as partners again through all of that. And then we were both pulled out to be replacements to go to England. And he wore glasses and he had to get a prescription or something, so he didn't leave with me, and I lost him. He wound up over in Europe, and of course I never saw him again. And then not too many years ago, I had a call on the phone. A fellow said, "Is this 17163268?" I said, "Yeah, I know who you are. You're 17163269, Ken Jones." And it was. He'd looked my name up on the internet. So Ellen and I, when we made a trip, we stopped. He lived in Peoria. Spent most of his career with Caterpillar, and we stopped and visited him. Of course, I hadn't seen him since in the 40s, early. And we had a real good visit, and we still correspond, email and so on.
Great.
But we spent a lot of time together in the service.
Was he the only guy you kept in touch with?
No, there are others. There's another in Atlanta that I still keep in touch with. That was both in Fort Benning and Camp Livingston. Another fellow that was actually wound up in Tulsa. We were together with but he died several years ago. But that's about it. That's about the.
Going back to what you mentioned earlier about your trip over to Belgium back in the 1990s, you said that there weren't a lot of the remnants or the scars of anything, but I know there are still some foxholes in some of the off the road areas. I mean, were you able to go back to any of the spots where you knew that you had dug a foxhole at one time and try to look for anything like that?
No, and the reason for that is when I was over there during the war, you really didn't know exactly where you were with regard to, say, the highway that you were driving on.
That's true.
We were out in the terrain. There'd be no earthly way unless there were some military maps or something that you had researched before you got over there. It would be extremely difficult to find exactly where you were. You knew generally where you were, but obviously we drove the road in the area heading towards St. Vith, which was our objective. But just exactly where we were in the countryside, there'd be no way to tell. But you're right, I'm sure some of those holes are probably still partially there somewhere.
Well, looking back at your experience, how did that affect your life? Did your military experience change your life at all, or stay with you and drive you in certain directions at all? Or
I would say the biggest thing the military experience had in one's life is that you grow up real fast. I went into the service when I was 17. I came out when I was 20, I guess it was. Yeah, 19, when I was 20 years old. So I would say that any of us in that era matured much faster of necessity than, say, kids today would. And it's understandable.
Sure. Okay, well, is there anything you'd like to add in closing or anything like
No,
that?
I think my purpose was to present what I had, and your questions also added an awful lot to it. And I hope that that it'll be something of interest to my kids and generations to follow.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for your time here today, and especially thank you for your service.
It's been a pleasure, and the work that you're doing in collecting this information is very much appreciated.
Okay, I appreciate that too. Okay, well, this concludes the interview. Thanks,
Okay.
Ed.